The Magi brought their treasures to Jesus. They offered to him what was most valuable to them. This was their great act of worship. This was how they responded to God's call in their lives. This was how they entered into a personal relationship with God. That personal relationship, what the Catechism calls to live in communion with God, is the source of true meaning in our lives. And the deeper that communion with God, the deeper our experience of meaning and fulfillment. And one way to deepen and strengthen our communion with God is simply to follow the example of the three wise men, to offer to Jesus our treasures, what is most valuable to us. Jesus himself calls us to do this in one of his most memorable parables, the parable of the talents. In this parable, we discover a very comforting truth, namely that everything we do, not just going to Mass and saying our prayers, everything we do can become an act of worship, can become a means for deepening our relationship with God. In this conference, we'll take some time to try and understand this parable a little more deeply. And we'll focus especially on 4 aspects. First, its context, where it appears in the Gospels. Second, its central meaning, its core message. Third, how it can apply to our lives. And fourth, a dangerous misinterpretation of this parable. The parable of the talents. It will be as when a man who was going on a journey called in his servants and entrusted his possessions to them. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to a third 1, to each according to his ability. Then he went away. Immediately the one who received 5 talents went and traded with them, and made another 5. Likewise the one who received 2 made another 2. But the man who received 1 went off and dug a hole in the ground and buried his master's money. After a long time the master of those servants came back and settled accounts with them. The one who had received 5 talents came forward, bringing the additional 5. He said, "Master, you gave me 5 talents. See, I have made 5 more." His master said to him, "Well done, my good and faithful servant. Since you were faithful in small matters, I will give you great responsibilities. Come, share your master's joy." Then the one who had received 2 talents also came forward and said, "Master, you gave me 2 talents. See, I have made 2 more." His master said to him, "Well done, my good and faithful servant. Since you were faithful in small matters, I will give you great responsibilities. Come, share your master's joy." Then the one who had received the 1 talent came forward and said, "Master, I knew you were a demanding person, harvesting where you did not plant and gathering where you did not scatter. So out of fear I went off and buried your talent in the ground. Here it is back." His master said to him in reply, "You wicked, lazy servant. So you knew that I harvest where I did not plant and gather where I did not scatter? Should you not then have put my money in the bank so that I could have got it back with interest on my return? Now then, take the talent from him and give it to the one with 10. For to everyone who has, more will be given, and he will grow rich. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. And throw this useless servant into the darkness outside, where there will be wailing and grinding of teeth." This parable of the talents appears in 2 Gospels, in Matthew chapter 25 and in Luke chapter 19. And in both cases, Jesus delivers the parable at the very end of his public ministry, just days before his passion. And both versions of the parable follow the same structure. There is a king who has to leave his kingdom for an extended period of time. Before leaving, he entrusts a good amount of wealth to his servants, so they can make use of it during his absence. When the king returns, each of his servants gives a report on how they invested their money, and each one receives a reward for doing so. Only one servant doesn't receive a reward, the servant who hid his money instead of investing it, instead of making use of it. That's the basic structure of the parable. In St. Matthew's case, this parable is one of 3 parables that have to do with the Last Judgment, and he seems to be emphasizing in the parable of the talents that we need to keep the Last Judgment in mind, even as we go through our normal daily activities, so as to keep our priorities straight. In St. Luke's version, he emphasizes that the nature of the kingdom isn't political. Rather, Christ's kingdom is a kingdom of grace that will grow and spread through the work of the church until he comes again. This is the context of the parable, and it's important for us to keep this context in mind as we begin to dig into the deeper meaning of the parable for our own lives. All of Christ's parables have a core message. Usually this core message is so rich in meaning that it can't be completely explained in one or two statements, which is exactly why he uses parables. In this case, the core message has to do with the relationship between the king and the servants, and how that relationship is affected by the servants' activities. Three aspects of this relationship are especially noteworthy. In the first place, the king wants his servants to be involved in building up his kingdom. He actually leaves his kingdom in their hands. He entrusts his kingdom to them in a very real sense. He gives them a share of his own wealth, and he leaves them the freedom to use that wealth however they see fit, to increase the overall wealth and prosperity of the kingdom. This shows how much the king values his servants, how he treats them with dignity and with respect, how he wants them to be partners in defending and caring for his kingdom. In the second place, the king rewards his servants superabundantly, out of all proportion to their actions. St. Matthew has the king saying to his servants, "Well done, my good and faithful servant. Since you were faithful in small matters, I will give you great responsibilities. Come, share your master's joy." St. Luke specifies what the king means by great responsibilities. He shows the servants being rewarded by being given governance over various cities in accordance with how much they increased the king's wealth during his absence. And this shows us God's hope and his dream for each one of us. He wants us to share in his own divine joy. He wants us to share in his own divine activity of governing the universe. In other words, he wants us to share in his own divine nature for all eternity. At the end of the parable, the distinction of roles between the king and the servants almost disappears. The king seems to elevate the servants to his very own level. This is their reward for faithfully administering the gifts they had received. In the third place, we see how the actions of one servant cut him off from the kingdom, destroying his relationship with the king. St. Matthew shows the king calling this servant wicked and lazy. In St. Luke's version, he's just called wicked. But in both versions, this servant is punished and excluded from the rewards that the others receive. This wicked servant didn't put to use the wealth he had received from the king. He hid it. He buried it in the ground. And so when the king returns, he has no profit to show from the gifts he had received. He makes some excuses, he makes some explanations, but the king doesn't accept them. The king tells the servant that he should have invested the wealth, that he should have made it bring a profit to the kingdom. That's what servants are supposed to do. Because he didn't, because he kept the gifts for himself alone, he is now excluded from the kingdom. He is sent into the darkness outside. We can see from these three aspects that the king involves his servants in the work of building up his kingdom, that he rewards his servants by giving them a greater participation in his own life and in his kingdom, and that those who refuse to invest in his kingdom will be excluded from it, that the relationship between the king and his servants is mediated, at least in part, through the servants' activities. In other words, those servants who receive and use the king's gifts generously, that is, for the good of the kingdom as a whole and not just for their personal good, actually deepen their relationship and their friendship with the king. And that is exactly the key point to keep in mind when we want to apply this parable to our own lives. The king in the parable is Christ himself. The servants are you and me and every member of the church. The money that the king gives to his servants stands for all the gifts that we receive from God. First of all, our supernatural gifts, like faith and grace and hope, but also our natural gifts, our talents, our skills, our opportunities in education, even our sufferings. Everything that God's providence permits to happen to us. The extended period of the king's absence stands for the age of the church as a whole, the time from Christ's ascension into heaven until his second coming and the final judgment. Each one of our lives takes place within that arc of time. And the message that Jesus wants us to take away from this parable is simply this, that how we choose to use the gifts we've received within whatever amount of time is allotted to us here on earth really matters. Our lives, and therefore all our gifts, have a true, meaningful purpose. We were created to live in communion with God, in relationship with Him. How we choose to administer our God-given gifts can either foster or frustrate that relationship. He is the King, the Lord of the universe, but He wants us to be part of His royal court, to participate in His work of salvation, to share in His life and in His joy. But He won't force us to do that. He gives us a choice every day. We can keep the gifts we have received to ourselves, like the wicked and lazy servant of the parable, or we can take those gifts and invest them so as to increase the wealth of Christ's kingdom. And the wealth of Christ's kingdom is measured in terms of love. Love for God and love for neighbor. So the message for us is simple. In order to keep growing in our relationship with God, the only relationship that will give us the meaning that we truly yearn for, we have to choose to invest our gifts in actions of love, of self-giving, of self-forgetful generosity towards God and neighbor. This is one of the ways that we bring our treasures, what is most valuable to us, to the feet of Jesus in an act of worship, just like the three wise men. Before moving on to the personal questionnaire, we need to pause and address a dangerous misinterpretation of this parable. It is possible, especially at the beginning of our spiritual lives, to interpret this parable through the lens of our own insecurities. Because we live in a fallen world, and because we ourselves are fallen human beings, wounded by our sins and the sins of others, we have a deep-seated tendency to doubt our self-worth, to doubt that we are truly lovable. When we allow this insecurity to dictate our behavior and our decisions, we can end up trying to earn other people's love, trying to make ourselves lovable by our achievements or some other activity. This is not a healthy way of life, because it's built on a false foundation. In God's eyes, we are lovable, infinitely lovable, in fact, in spite of all our falls and faults and sins and wounds. This is the amazing, wild message of the gospel that, as St. Paul puts it, God proves His love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. This comes across clearly in the parable if we're willing to look. The king is already interested in his servants. He already cares for them before they do or achieve anything. The servants have no wealth of their own. They have nothing that attracts the king. Everything they have, all their wealth, they receive from the king, who gives it to them as a sign of his devotion to them. This is our case in relation to God. All that we are, all that we have, life, hope, the earth, faith, friendship, every good thing that exists is a gift from God, a sign of His total love for us and dedication to us. And so when the king goes away and leaves his servants with a chance to invest their gifts in his kingdom, he's not withholding his love from them until they prove themselves worthy. It's just the opposite. He's showing his love for them, and he's hoping that they will respond to the gifts they've received by giving of themselves to him in return, thereby deepening their relationship with him. That's how friendship works. Friendship grows when each friend invests in things that matter to both. And so when God gives us all the gifts that He's given us, and gives us freedom and time in which to choose how we'll use those gifts, He's giving us a chance to grow in our friendship with Him. He's giving us a chance to choose to make what matters to God matter also to us. We don't have to earn God's love. We just have to welcome it. Take some time now to reflect on the 10 questions in the personal questionnaire, which are designed to help you discover new ways to grow in your friendship with the Eternal King.